Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edgar Peterser. I'm the director of the African Center for Cities and your host and moderator for these 5 webinars that ACC is convening in close collaboration and partnership with the Alfred Herrhausen Gesellschaft, with Dark Matter Labs, with, I'm forgetting our partners, which is rather embarrassing, with Peak Urban, which is a critical partner, and of course the Gothenburg Center for Sustainable Development and Mr. Urban Futures. It's wonderful to have you back. We had a great start last week when we had Carlos Lopez and Yvonne from the Mayor of Freetown explore with us some of the macro questions with regard to Africa's urbanization and how do we change course. Sort of 2 highlights that is worth remembering from last week is that Carlos argued quite vociferously that, that what we've got to recognize is this is an opportunity to be bold, to be ambitious. And because Africa is not burdened by a number of the challenges associated with sunk infrastructure and with established patterns of urban development, we've got an opportunity to do things differently and to learn from the rest of the world. What was striking from what Yvonne shared with us last week is how important it is, despite the complexity and the scale of the challenges, is to be systematic, to establish priorities, and to make oneself completely vulnerable to the citizens and urban stakeholders by being completely transparent. And so what they've done in Freetown is precisely to undertake detailed planning, but also to make set targets and to insist that citizens hold them accountable as a way of working against entrenched cultures of patronage and corruption. And so in that context today, we're gonna drill down deep on this question of the politics of urban transformation, or rather the political economy of urban transformation. And to set the scene, and before I introduce our fantastic panelists for today and speak a little bit about the logistics, let me share with you a couple of points to keep in mind as we go through this afternoon. So again, as we stated last week, the great news is that our political leaders have recognized urbanization as critical. It's on the policy agenda, it's reflected in various Pan-African agreements, and we now have 38 countries that have some version of a national urban plan or urban policy. The quality of these are highly variable, and to say that they are strategic and that they're going to make the difference to get us onto a sustainable trajectory would be to overstate the case. And so what we're interested in is how do we take these important political openings at the macro political environment and think a lot more precisely about how one uses those opportunities to in fact sustain transformative change. So of course, as with all of these policy agreements, whether it's the SDGs, it's climate agreements, resilience, risk, whatever the case might be, the biggest risk we face is that politicians simply pay lip service, that they play the game, that they try and attract resources by playing the game. But we then often in our analysis, I think, resort to a very simplistic approach. We say, oh, the problem is there's no political will. And this is just not good enough. We can't just sort of explain everything away with this idea of political will that is somehow absent. We've got to be a lot more systematic. So I want to suggest to you that there's maybe 4 binding constraints baked into the political economy of most African cities. The first is that indeed our political systems and the political cultures associated with that, they are distorted. They tend to be captured by vested interest of one form or another. And this can then manifest in, for example, departmental rivalries between various ministers or between various sectors. And there's certainly evidence in many places that rent-seeking practices are often what oils the political machine in these places. And if you're not able to understand that landscape and engage with it, it's very hard to get anything done. The second problem, which is more structural, but it has a symbiotic relationship with this political culture, is the question of path dependency. There's a lock-in of certain infrastructural decisions that have been made in the colonial and in the post-colonial periods that pertains to various infrastructure systems. And what we've seen in most places is that this has ended up serving predominantly middle classes and the elites. and that the majority population in many of these places have had to improvise around these limited network infrastructure systems as a way of accessing some form of service delivery. Now, related to that question of path dependency in terms of infrastructure investment decisions is the problem of the professional knowledge systems, right? So the water engineers, the transport engineers, etc., they all are trained and steeped in very particular ways of thinking about these infrastructure systems. And for them, it's about extending what exists so that you can get coverage for everyone. However, that doesn't address questions of sustainability, of material intensivity, in terms of questions of carbon efficiency and so forth. And so how we shift these professional knowledge domains onto a footing that recognizes the importance of holism, of the codependency of various infrastructure systems so that we can begin to craft a more inclusive and resilient system is a big issue, because it's not just about these professional knowledge systems controlling what is valid knowledge and what is not. They also often are what controls the big departments, whether it's a national utility, a national department, or a municipal department at the urban scale. And so how do we address at the same time the logics that drive the political economy, the larger questions of lock-in, and then the professional knowledge systems that tend to dominate what is regarded as a viable or an appropriate technological infrastructural approach. So just with those couple of points about how we can think a bit more precisely about these political economy constraints, one of the questions that we need to then pose today is what's available to us to strengthen the hand of city governments and to strengthen civic power within our cities as a counterpoint, as a counterweight to some of these dynamics. Secondly, how can a focus on sustainable infrastructure, as we argue in the primer that we've made available for this webinar series, how can we use that agenda to begin to reinforce the broader argument for democratic devolution? So one of, again, the overriding features of the policy landscape is that most African governments have ostensibly committed to democratic decentralization for the last 20 to 30 years. But we've seen very little of that translate into substantive policy reform in terms of fiscal devolution and in terms of substantive powers at the city scale. So can we think through the content of sustainable infrastructure and this political question of democratic devolution and how that can be connected? So on this point, I want to then reference the fact that we've got two colleagues on the panel today. Hastings Chikoko, who is the Africa Director for the C40 network, or the, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong sheet, my apology. These people have illustrious CVs, and so I'm trying to be as pithy and to the point, and I would highly recommend you Google them as you listen to them after the meeting. So I've just selected a few things to mention. So Hastings is the Regional Director for Africa at C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. He's also on the Global Supervisory Council or board of the Wetlands International, and then has a string of other professional experiences and qualifications, and hails originally from the city of Blantyre, but I think now calls Pretoria home in terms of family life and the office, but works all over the continent and interacts on a regular basis with political leaders, particularly mayors and so forth. We also have Sithole Mbanga, who's the Deputy Secretary General of United Cities and Local Governments of Africa. And Sithole has also been at the helm of the South African Cities Network, which is a very unique club of the metropolitan governments in South Africa that have pooled resources to do research together and to fulfill an advocacy function in the intergovernmental system. Similar to Hastings, extensive experience in various institutional settings and academic qualifications and so forth. Now, Sithole, of course, can bring to bear their perspective and role in addressing this question of the absence of meaningful democratic decentralization. The third person on our panel is Astrid Haas, who is the Policy Director of the International Growth Center, which is a very important think tank in the urban development space. She was previously the senior country economist for cities and head of the Cities That Work initiative, also at the IGC. She's currently based in Kampala and has worked extensively with senior political officers and political leaders in Africa, but including with the acting mayor of Kabul. And she's currently also part of the Municipal Finance Reform Task Force of the Hargeisa Municipal Government in Somaliland. And she's got, again, extensive experience from across the continent and is in an interesting position where she moves between the world of applied research and policy advice. And I think, again, is fantastically placed to give us an insight. And then finally, we've got Professor Taibat Lawanson, who is at in the Urban Planning Department at the University of Lagos, Nigeria, where she leads the Pro-Poor Development Research Cluster, and she serves as the acting director of the Center for Housing and Sustainable Development. She's got extensive publications and is an active African academic intellectual leading on a whole bunch of debates across the continent and globally. And in fact, because she is in such high demand, we only have her for half an hour today because she's got to move into another event where she is speaking, which is a convening of the University of Sheffield. So this then brings me to the logistics for this afternoon. Taibat will speak first. She'll share some reflections with us. We'll then immediately go to some questions and answers for her. And on that note, the chat function is open throughout the webinar. So you can pose questions as the session goes along and then restate that or reframe it afterwards, or we might invite you to speak to your question in the Q&A time. After Taibat, we'll go over to Astrid, and she will, after Taibat's reflections using Lagos, her home city, as a, if you will, a reference point, we'll ask Astrid to talk to us about her perspective from her vantage point about some of these dynamics. We'll then at that point switch over to Hastings, who will share his reflections. And because Hastings them are always on the lookout for progressive mayors who wants to do things differently, I think it will be fantastic to hear how, sort of how do they read the landscape? How do they build these leaders, and how do they strengthen networks of these leaders who go against the grain? And then we'll have a substantive moment for question and answer. And then after that, we'll ask Sithole from his vantage point in this Pan-African perspective to share some reflections based on the discussion and the questions. So that's how we're going to run the afternoon. And I want to warmly welcome everyone, and particularly our esteemed panel. And without further ado, Taibat, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you very much, and greetings from West Lagos. It's raining now, so if my voice is not too good, let me know so I can switch off the video and save some bandwidth.
All good, so sounds wonderful so far.
So I'll just start by, what does urban transformation really mean? And in the context of Lagos, a city of over 20 million people, it's a heavy burden, and it's a fast race to the top on the part of the government, on the part of the people, and particularly on the part of the urban poor, who make up about 60% of the population. So theorists like Professor Vanessa Watson have told us about the conflicting rationalities of development, and this is the case in Lagos, where the government aspires to be, for us to be the model, Africa's model mega city, and running, a Dubai development model. Unfortunately, the Dubai model seems not to be working as planned, because just last week, our governor reminded his executive to copy the model, but the model, particularly in light of recent global disruptions caused by COVID-19, has been seen to have many gaps. So everyday people in Lagos, particularly those who migrate to for a better life, Lagos provides an opportunity for them to access that better life. coming either from smaller towns and cities or from the rural areas. Lagos is, you know, like their own Olympus, like their own place of where their dreams come true. And as it is said in Lagos, you know, once you come to Lagos, no matter what you do, because we have the numbers, you can make a good life. For the urban poor, who make up over 60%, like I said, the reality of Lagos is just one for survival. If they can make it through the day and to the next day, then life is good. And most of them are employed in the informal economy, earning $1 a day. Over the last 20 years, since the return to democracy in Nigeria, Lagos has been the poster child of what to do. And there have been extensive public sector reforms, starting with the plan. Lagos is operationalizing the Lagos Economic Development Plan 2012 to 2025. And within that plan are lots of programs across housing, infrastructure, construction, and the like. Many projects have come on board, and on the screen here are listed some. However, the processes by which the government tends to favor the large-scale aspirational projects that tend to put us on the world map. And that's why you have things like the Eco-Atlantic City of the 2000s, and more recently, we have extensive dredging of the lagoon and the ocean to create luxury islands. Lagos is a grossly unequal city with a Gini coefficient of about 0.64, meaning the distance between the haves and the have-nots is quite wide. Over the last 20 years, this differentiation has continued to grow, and so the rich are enclaving themselves on the islands and the waterfront communities, gated communities, while the poor, you know, have to contend with the city and recreate the city on their own terms. Some of the consequences, I started with unintended, and then I realized that some of them may not be really unintended, but they are just what happens when we focus on the top-down planning, or we focus on planning for a city without taking into consideration the reality of the population. If you have a population of 64% living in slum-like conditions, then the priorities for development shouldn't be aspirational projects. They should be more of grounded opportunities to lift people out of poverty and provide opportunities for low income and lower middle income. Placements, market demolition, the economic policy of the government has been hostile to a lot of small businesses. For example, you know, the Okada ban, the commercial motorcycle have time and time again, usually accusing them of carelessness, accusing them of crime, without providing feasible, workable alternatives for people to go about their daily lives. And so we've had even the destruction of the built heritage assets, but one cannot remove that from our aspiration to be like Dubai. So we want to have these shiny buildings, forgetting the uniqueness of our African cultural heritage. And there have been consequences. Because of the dredging, there's less fresh fish than we should have. And then a lot of the waterfront communities are getting silted, and you know, there's flooding, there's extensive flooding, which is usually blamed on the population for not having good waste management practices. So within the political economy, what should we be looking at in the context of Lagos? In Lagos, you know, the first thing is who has access to urban resources. Lagos is a very fortunate city because of our history as an economic hub, even from the colonial times till recent times, when till the 1900s, when we were the nation's capital, until 1991, when that capital moved to Abuja. But the city retains its status as an economic hub, and it prides itself of being the 5th largest economy in Africa. But then who has access to the urban resources? And tied to that question is who wields power? Who wields political power? Who wields economic power? And who wields terror power? Who has the hang on violence? Incidentally, the political institutions, the politicians are not far removed from some of the more grounded bodies, the institutions that are closer to the people, and they are able to partner with these institutions to wield power over land, over public space, and over economic activity. Take, for example, the traditional rulers. Traditional rulers tend to have powers or hold land in trust for their families and their constituents, and the state have been able to, align with them, cooperate with them, and we've had a spate of special displacements, forced evictions in quite a few communities that have now been replaced by these gated communities. Take, for example, the Elegushi, the Otodogbame, the infamous Otodogbame situation was born from such an alliance. The Union of Road Workers is another, I think it is the most violent group in the city. And just 3 days ago, our deputy governor said, well, we can't ban them because we work with them. And in the last year or so, that union has wielded considerable violence on gig economy, particularly, the go-karders and the Ubers in the city, claiming that they are taking their space and they are not paying appropriate ground taxes. And the government came and negotiated, provided a platform for negotiating within these controllers of violence and other businesses for the control of the public space. The third is the market unions. The market unions, the Yaloja, are the ones who control political power at the street, and then they determine who sells and who doesn't sell. They determine what you sell and what you don't sell. And oftentimes they are the platform or the conduit to which some of the spatial practices are being implemented. Take, for example, the computer village. Computer village is the largest computer market in the whole of Africa, and it is an informal market. But place is now being relocated, to the outskirts of the city to serve some economic interests. Which economic interest, it is not yet known, but the instrumentality of the market unions are being used to push this agenda. So when you have the state, hiding behind these institutions that should be the support structure for the masses, you then wonder that what are the real interests, and who are we serving? Who are these political institutions serving? I must also say that the local government system in Lagos is very disenfranchised. It is incapacitated. And so there's a lot of centralization of governance. The state government holds power and distributes resources and, determines what goes on around the city. And so it's very difficult for the average person, to access government, particularly to, when they have issues, or even if it's to, to complain or to request for one form of infrastructure or the other. And so people take to social media to express their discontent, and oftentimes, because to avoid embarrassment, government is quick to respond. And then the million-dollar question is, how do we reconcile these conflicting rationalities of development? Government is aspiring to be Dubai, but it's using methods that are very different, to achieve her aim. People are aspiring to a better life, and they have to go oftentimes in subversive manner, using subversive methods to achieve, their development or to achieve daily life. Take, for example, the commercial cyclists that I talked about earlier, the street traders, and now even, like Uber drivers and the like. And so the question is, how do we move towards, you know, a direction of greater sustainability, inclusiveness, and social justice? Lagos also, you know, became a direct, you know, became intentional about achieving the SDGs with the coming in of this particular government in 2019 and has an SDG office. But some of these practices of hostility towards, you know, people at the lower levels of society still remain. And so it's important for us to remind ourselves of the agreements that our government signed, particularly also to remind the government of the agreements that they aspire to or that they sign. By virtue of Lagos opening enough for SDGs, it binds itself to work towards urban development for social inclusion and ending poverty. And some of the ways you need to do that, it is not by top-down elitist methods. There is need for, you know, top-down infrastructure or large-scale investments and programs, but a lot of the bottom-up, a lot of the grounded activities of local people also need to be recognized. Governance needs to be decentralized, particularly at the local government. People in the streets and in the neighborhoods really don't know who to turn to when they have issues. And it's also easier for them to partner with the religious organizations in their communities than it is to partner with government. And we saw that during the COVID-19, when people turned to their neighbors and to their religious organizations in their communities to get palliatives and support. There's also a need to dismantle the gatekeepers and these corruption enablers, particularly at the unions, the market unions, and the traditional institutions, the tweaking of their powers. While they are necessary, you know, the way they have been practicing has really, really been anti-people. So there's need for us to dismantle and recraft how those institutions can work for people. And finally, there is need to catalyze economic opportunities. Lagos is a very poor city. If you go by the amount of poverty on the streets, then we cannot really pride ourselves on being this 5th largest economy on the continent. We have to provide jobs and opportunities, and we have to provide jobs and opportunities that are fit for purpose, that our people can aspire to. A lot of the jobs, even the low and middle income jobs in Lagos, have been taken up by the Chinese. And so I think there is need to question that. How do we create opportunities that our people can plug into? And one way we can do that is to recognize what people are already doing. There are lots of opportunities within the informal economy. Unfortunately, the informal economy often suffers an acceptance challenge. They are often branded as illegal, and so the agency and the benefits that can be accrued, you know, from that sector of the economy tends to go unrecorded. So I'll stop here for now, but I think the important thing is just to open it up and recognize that both top-down and bottom-up organization has to go hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taibat, for that incredibly incisive and comprehensive overview, and to bring some of the really hard and intractable challenges that I think is evident in most African cities to the fore. If I may start with a first question, and then we'll give an opportunity to people in the audience to pose questions in the chat function or to raise a hand. So these institutions that are so central in mediating everyday life, traditional authorities, the road unions and so on, has there been a discussion about, because what you've said in your talk as well is that one can't wish them away. They're reality, they're part of the fabric, but clearly there needs to be some kind of adaptation of those institutions, the roles they play, their level of accountability, and for them to come in behind a different vision for the city. are there examples of, are these debates happening within these organizations or between civil society organizations and these institutions? And are there any experiments going on that tries to reimagine how these organizations are functioning?
Well, people are starting to get aware that these organizations wield the kind of power that they do, and that the kind of power that they wield has implications on how the rest of us live, within the city. I think it is the awareness that is coming on now. The conversation about what to do with them or what to do about them is yet to begin in any meaningful ways. And that's particularly because they enjoy a lot of endorsement from the authorities, from the state.
Mm-hmm. And that's because they are very powerful in securing political support for the political parties. They play an important role. I mean, okay.
Yes, they have the numbers. The unions, the road unions is male dominated, and that they have the numbers, and the market unions are female dominated, and they also have the numbers at the ground. So they are able to wield enormous political power, but the state has found a way to engage them, align with them, partner with them, and so the priorities or the concerns of the public, of those they serve even, become secondary.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and not for you to respond directly, but just again to mark for the audience. So this issue of multiple forms of authority and governance that coexist in these places is, of course, a dynamic that we see in many other African cities, and particularly the contemporary form of traditional authorities, and as you correctly pointed out, their centrality to how land markets function. So I just want to flag that as something that we may want to return to in the conversation after you've left us, Tybert, because I think that this is really one of the very uniquely African issues that we've got to find a language to talk about much more explicitly and to think about what are possible responses. I guess the broader question that I just want to mark for now, and then Tybert, I don't see any questions from any audience members. I will allow you to step out and join your other meeting. But I just want to flag for now that from your remarks, it seems that one of the challenges we face is to rethink planning processes and how planning processes can strengthen power at the grassroots, can strengthen the voice of citizens, and also give a role and a purpose to these critical intermediating institutions like the unions and the traditional authorities and so forth. And so kind of building on Vanessa's work that you cited about conflicting rationalities, how we rethink what planning means beyond the usual tropes of bottom up and top down, I think would be maybe something that would be really helpful to unpack. And I'm going to look to my other panelists to maybe give us examples of how they've wrestled with that question. So I just want to thank you, Tybert, for, I know this has been a very tricky afternoon for you because you had these conflicting commitments. Thank you for joining us for the first 40 minutes of this session, and for really laying the table in terms of the sort of real world issues that we've got to grapple with if we want to get our heads around the question of the political economy of urban transformation. Thank you and go well.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. I will then go straight on to Astrid and ask her to share with us her reflections.
Thank you very much, Edgar, and thank you very much for inviting me to these sessions. As you know, there's nothing I love chatting about more than our urban futures. It's because it's something I really do believe in, and I believe this is, probably our biggest opportunity now that we have to unleash. I will start by caveating that Tibet has sent her thunderstorm all the way across the continent, and it has now reached Kampala. And if we're talking about infrastructure, we seem to have direct correlation here between thunderstorms and lack of electricity. So if I'm suddenly gone, I do have backup options, so I will rejoin. But I think it sets the scene very well for what it means when we're talking about infrastructure in cities. I'm going to start by just illustrating my own city, Kampala, and how it just highlights a lot of what we're going to, what Tibet has mentioned in Lagos, but I think what we'll even unpack even more in this discussion. Because Kampala is a fascinating case study of the politics of urban change, or how a national government grapples with how to manage a city. And Edgar, sort of picking up on your points of multiple forms of authority, it also reminds me it's how we can create even more authorities when a lot of authorities already exist. And I think that's something to keep in the back of the mind too. So up until July 1st this year, Kampala was the only city in Uganda. There was no other designated city. On July 1st, between July 1st of this year and I think 2023, we're going to get 15 new cities suddenly. But up until July 1st, it was the only city. Up until 2010, it was treated like a local government. It came under the Ministry of Local Government. It was managed like any other local government. It was headed by an elected Lord Mayor. Now, through a series of issues that I will come to in the points that I'm going to make, that was upended through legislation that was passed by Parliament, an act that was passed by Parliament, and a couple of things happened. Kampala was renationalized. It became a ministry under, and this is important, under the office of the President. It therefore gained a minister and a deputy minister appointed by the president. It then also gained a position that was created specifically for Kampala of executive director and deputy executive director. These are technocrats. But again, these are presidential appointees. These are not appointed by the Public Service Commission. It, however, also maintained the position of a Lord Mayor, and the Lord Mayor continued to be elected by the people. Now, why is this important? Well, it becomes very important because in the initial piece of legislation, the relative powers between these different authorities was not clarified. And this has a lot to say in terms of how the governance of Kampala has worked since that. And in particular, it comes to a head because Kampala, like many other cities across the continent, but actually many cities in the world, is an opposition stronghold. And so when you have different authorities appointed by different, well, elected by the people, appointed by the ruling party, essentially by the president, this then creates sort of multiple tensions. How this is played out, and I don't want to go into it in detail, but happy to talk through anyone in a sense, is that in 2012, the mayor was impeached. Between 2012 and 2016, a lot of reform happened in the city. In 2016, an election year, the ruling party of the country lost even more votes in Kampala. So after 2016, the executive director lost the faith of the president. That came to a head, and the first executive director resigned. A new minister was appointed. And then only recently, in I think this year, the legislation started to be amended to start clarifying the relative positions. Oh, and the impeached Lord Mayor from 2012 ran again in 2016 and obviously came back with a vengeance, right? And so we see this playing out and how it works. On top of this, so there's, the politics of how the city is run. There is also what is the city? And Kampala is again, a very classic example of many, many cities, which has totally outgrown in its administrative boundaries. So all of those people I've just mentioned, they manage the administrative Kampala, which is not the city Kampala. The city Kampala spans then again over another 3 local governments who are managed by the Ministry of Local Government. Oh, and then also we have a Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development, which has urban as part of its mandate. And so then the question becomes, who manages the greater Kampala? How is that managed? And if we have commuters, that about 2 million commuters a day, which apparently is the same as Greater London to London, where they live and where they work and how they're transported is very much dependent on what the spatial form is of the city. Now, how do we get to where we got to? And I think this, again, I'm just going to provide some ideas about what I think it is. And I think the drivers of that shape this, I've sort of categorized into five pieces. And this is not, I'm not speaking just about Kampala here. I think this applies to many of the cities that I work with. One is historical. Edgar, you mentioned in your opening remarks the sort of path dependency of sunk infrastructure. But actually, I think perhaps more importantly, in some senses, in many of the cities, it's the path dependency of why our cities are where they are, who they were built for, which, you know, at the time is very different than the people who live here right now. And I think importantly, something we do probably power to change and investing in more infrastructure with limited resources is the path dependency of legislation. So any sort of city that is suffering from the hangover of the Town and Country Planning Act will know what I mean by a hangover of legislation that has very much shaped the urban form. The second part is political. So I've mentioned cities being opposition strongholds. And I think, you know, this is potentially something that's, you know, as urbanization moves forth and as people, as Taibat mentioned, people come to cities searching for opportunities, but the opportunities are not there. That's what essentially creates opposition. And so we may see that actually increasing in the future. But I think there's another political component that is really important to bring up, which is that, you know, yes, I agree with you that it's, you know, urbanization has been paid lip service in a lot of the agendas, and we have national urbanization policies. But when you hear, particularly at a national level, a lot of politicians talk, it's still seen as an either or trajectory, right? Either we can do urbanization or we can serve the agricultural poor. And I think that's really important in thinking about how we need to change the narrative and how we need to show that it's actually a national strategy and not an either or strategy. So I think, yes, it's a big step that we have a lot of documents that mention urbanization, but it's actually sort of the change that is needed in the perception of what it means. The third is the economic side, and this is sort of where I say there's a little bit of a schizophrenic, like in management of cities, there's a little bit of a schizophrenic approach. On the one hand, they are often opposition strongholds. On the other hand, they're the biggest generators of a country's GDP and tax revenue, and therefore cannot be ignored. And so how do you reconcile this? And in particular, how do you reconcile this when cities have been, in many cases, devolved a lot of, as Edgar, you pointed out, a lot of responsibility, but actually not, you know, my background is in municipal finance. Cities are super constrained in how they can raise money. And that's a really big problem when you have a lot of services and infrastructure to provide. And I think that schizophrenic approach is really to do with, we want to ignore it because it's opposition, but we can't ignore it because it produces, you know, it's a generator of a lot of our money. The fourth point I want to make is in this whole political economy spectrum, again, a player that we often forget in this multiple authority circle, but I think is an extremely important player when we think about African cities, are development partners. And because they do come with some of the largest budgets that we have to be able to transform the cities, but to whom do they report, right? They have, you know, they are spending taxpayer monies from whichever country their taxpayer monies are coming from. So what is it that they want to see, and what is it that their taxpayers want to see, and does that actually reflect what it is that we want to see in our cities? You know, sometimes yes, sometimes no, but you know, how do we make those decisions, and who makes those decisions? And then fifthly, this is just echoing a point that Taibat made with the sort of Lagos vision of Dubai. I think I call it the misguided notion of the ideal. I think this is really epitomized for me in this whole discussion of smart cities and what does that really mean, and for who is it? And I think we've just been taken a little bit away about what, you know, what is inherently a city. A city is the place about the people, and where people come, and what people and firms want to come and find opportunities, and where those opportunities should be realized and innovation can happen. And it's not about flashy this and flashy that. And I think we need to just get back from that. So just to sort of now moving away from the challenges, where do I see the opportunities? Well, one, I think, and this is the thing which gets me really excited, you know, Africa is still relatively at the beginning of our urbanization process. We still have 2/3 of our cities to be built. More excitingly, the biggest opportunity in urbanization and the biggest change that's going to happen are not the cities like Kampala. It's like the secondary cities, and the ones that don't actually even exist yet as cities. And why is that exciting? Because they don't have the historical path dependency. They're actually, these cities are springing up for the exact reason cities should be springing up, because that's where people want to congregate for certain reasons. So how can we get those cities right? We have a massive opportunity to do that and to rethink that. And we have it, you know, doing that now. We're rethinking it from scratch before those cities actually even exist, without having sort of a historical hangover. I think the second piece is, and here I want to call out some work that my colleague, who I think is on the call here, Shah, he's been doing a lot of thinking about what it means to actually devolve power to cities beyond just the sort of lip service. And I think at a very first stage, it's just clarifying what you would like the cities to do. Like, much needs to go beyond that. But we see in a lot of case studies, this sort of reluctant devolution actually results in more confusion than anything else. So let's start by clarifying. Let's start by making decisions. And as I continue to say, let's show that this is a national strategy. I think one of the things that really makes African cities stand out is this rural-urban continuum. People have a house in the city, but they have a home in the village, and they move back and forth, and remittances get sent back and forth, and people come seasonally, and some people have part of their family in the village. This is something that we see across the continent. So this is actually, urbanization is a national strategy. It's not an either-or one. There's a massive opportunity in the youth. And, you know, we think about, we say this again, and you know, there's many reasons youth are an opportunity. But the reason I want to put forward here is that they come with ideas, and they don't come with the dependency. And often they themselves have been born in the city. So actually a lot of Africa's urban growth is happening from people who are now being born in cities. And so they have the opportunity to imagine what their cities, but we need to be able to provide them a voice to do that. I think the final thing I would like to sort of say as an opportunity is that Africa's urbanization is happening later, and we often sort of lament, or I hear the fact lamented that we are urbanizing in a climate-constrained, resource-constrained world, whereas the rest of the world was able to pollute themselves away to industrialization and everything else. But actually, I want to flip that and say, actually, we're urbanizing in the most data-rich world that we have. Now, data, not in the sense of, you know, wanting to go for smart city strategies, but more data and how do we understand people? How do we understand who it is that we're serving? And how do we allocate our limited resources to be able to actually do that? We have the biggest opportunity, that more so than any other place that has urbanized prior to us, to be able to harness that power. And I think here, I just want to call out the capacity piece that Edgar, you pointed out. It's really exciting to see more and more urban scholarship on the continent. So obviously African Center for Cities leading the way, but Taiba in the University of Lagos doing like phenomenal work. And just now, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, I received a concept note that Makerere University, which is the university in my city, wants to build up a center for urban research too. And that's what we need. That's what we need to be able to change this narrative. I just wanted to finalize on a sort of 2 points. One, preempting a question that I know I'm going to be asked, because it seems to be that I'm asked this in every seminar I speak about this. They say, well, you know, everything you've said, Astrid, shouldn't we just have a blueprint? And my answer is absolutely not. Cities are extremely context specific. They're about the people who live there. And so actually what we need is we need more voices for the people who live there. We can take learnings from other cities, and we definitely should, and we should definitely try, and we should adapt those learnings. But ultimately we need to listen to who's there and what's there, and to whom the city is a city. And just to finalize on what was a really fantastically written primer for this series of conversations, you know, it was pointed out that, you know, this is a great opportunity because we have a convergence of all of these policy pieces. And I say, yes, no, absolutely, I agree. But our window of opportunity is really, really small. We have about 30 years until all of these cities are going to be there and built. And so what I just wanted to finalize on is exactly the words that Carlos was harping on, and I cannot harp on it, you know, even more. Let's be bold, let's be ambitious, let's act, let's learn from that action, course correct if necessary, but move forward to be able to unleash this potential for our cities.
Fantastic, great, Astrid. That was a tour de force and incredibly rich. And so I'm gonna just before we go on to Hastings, maybe ask if there's, just check if there's comments or reflections in the chat function. So there is I'll just read it because it's simpler, from Lene Leroux. That's a very critical observation for me too. The multiple political interests with varying power and different perspectives of how things in the city need to run. Great presentation too by Taiba. I wonder if it wouldn't be worthwhile to understand the networks between these parties, the flows, but also the disruptions through contentious politics. City spatial plans are already always involved in trade-offs while attempting to have a long-term strategy. Perhaps planners' role could be around showing and mediating opposing interests, but through a multiplicity and complexity lens. So it's a comment, but I think the theme of contentious politics and how we sort of specify that and think through that, because obviously most of these interests that, if you will, want to keep things the way they are, cannot be wished away and has to be engaged. So yeah, so I don't know if you have an immediate reflection on that, Astrid, or we could just treat it as a comment for the ongoing discussion.
No, I mean, I do have a reflection, and one of the reflections is that, you know, often a time we treat people, particularly in the informal sector, as the opposition and as the ones that, you know, don't really need, but actually they're the ones driving the economy. So transport is a great example. Taibat's case in Lagos is totally fascinating, but the politics of transport system exists everywhere, particularly where we have this paratransit sector. And one of the realizations that Kampala has recently, Kampala has tried for, well, is trying for now for a very long time to bring in a BRT. And the idea was to really supplant it across the paratransit sector. And that just hasn't worked for reasons that you can probably imagine. And it's only now that they've opened up to dialogue with the paratransit sector and actually, you know, understanding that they've been running transport in this country for decades. They understand it better than anyone else. So how do we bring them in? So I think that's exactly it, this sort of media. It's not about transplanting anything on top. And it's the same with physical development plans. I mean, how many physical development plans are like huge and ambitious and reflect absolutely nothing of how the city looks right now? Mm-hmm. It's about how you understand what's there, why it functions, what doesn't function about it, and you mediate between those pieces. And I think here again, harking on the scholarship part, I'm not sure that's exactly what's taught yet. I'm not an urban planner myself, and I'm an urban economist, but I think even in the urban economics profession, rather than being taught about sort of listening, reflecting, and sort of figuring out what's there, what works, and how that fits within the models, you're taught models. And then obviously like your fallback option are models. And so therefore I think, you know, this is for those who do work in the urban scholarship areas. It's how we also rethink about how we teach about urban and how people are able to reflect on that as well.
Great. Thanks, Astrid. So I think if we focus on the last part of Astrid's talk about what the opportunities are, this takes us squarely into the domain of the work that C40 does. And I think this is a great opportunity to ask Hastings to share with us some of their work. But also, you know, how do you navigate all of this complexity that we've just heard from both Taibat and Astrid? How do you operate within that environment, but bring to the fore the climate agenda specifically, but also focus on transformative priorities? So Hastings, the floor is yours, and I look forward to your reflections. Thank you.
And hello, everyone. May I begin, Edgar, by just congratulating you and African Center for Cities for really organizing these sessions. I found the first one very useful and really look forward to the ones to come. Right, I'll build on what Astrid has ended or finished with. We must be bold, we must be ambitious, and then the list went. But I want to build on that and reflect on how city networks like C40 are advancing greater political ambition and accountability on sustainable urbanization. Since I'll be talking a lot about C40, let me just start by saying a bit about the organization for those that do not know C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. Quickly, in one sentence, it is a group of mega cities of the world, supporting mayors to achieve sustainability and resilience in their cities by addressing climate change. So C40, as the name suggests, is a leadership group. And membership to C40 is about commitment to demonstrate boldness, ambitious leadership on sustainable and resilient urbanization. So for information, C40 member cities do not pay any money as a membership fee. They pay for membership fee by adhering to what we call leadership standards. I think we've talked about we need to be strict. We need to really make sure that things are happening. So C40 has what we call leadership standards. The somewhat obvious fact is that you don't belong to a leadership group by simply paying money. You belong to a leadership group by demonstrating leadership. So that's the spirit that C40 embraces.
Hastings, I'm going to be very naughty and ask, so can you be kicked out?
Yes, I'll get to that. So C40 member cities, assessed every 6 months on how they are performing. So every 6 months, there is a compliance report sent to mayors on how they are adhering to the leadership standards. The month 6 is just a check-in report, but the end of the year is the one that is really, that determines whether the city should continue or not. If they are not adhering to the leadership standards, yes, Edgar, they are removed from the C40 membership. And we have already lost some few cities, one in Africa, unfortunately, but name withheld. So it's really not just a club that embraces quality, that embraces quantity. It's about what they do. It's about quality. It's not just bragging that we have 1,000 members, but what is it that they are doing? So given the time I have, let me just share at least 3 of those political leadership standards that we look for in our member cities to ensure a thriving political economy. First, political leadership is about a high ambition, clear vision, and evidence-based policies, strategies, and plans that are inclusive and transformative. Sometimes, our problem is not about money. Rather, it is about poor planning. If we were to get the money, the problems will still remain. It is like a surprise win of a lottery without a plan. Sometimes because there's no plan, you find that the person who has all this money does nothing. So to be transformational, we need to constantly question whether our vision, goals, and objectives are correct. So transformative cities set goals that are globally aligned, goals that reflect the global aspirations and standards, but at the same time, and most importantly, locally relevant. There was a talk about smart cities, some things that we just copy and bring to our cities. They may not be, without testing whether they are locally relevant. This means developing models that are effective in our cities, but good to make our cities competitive in a global economy. So to achieve this, C40 is supporting its member cities in developing solid policies and climate action plans. We provide standards, frameworks, tools, technical capacity for planning. And those C40 cities in Africa have been going through this process for the past 2.5 years. Is it easy? Not easy, but it has to be done. We need to be bold and ambitious. So the process ensures that the city's sustainability and resilience policy agenda and actions are well aligned to international frameworks like the Paris Agreement, SDGs, New Urban Agenda, Agenda 2063, and so on, because they provide a kind of like a global framework, a guiding framework. Secondly, the process ensures that the city's sustainability and resilience agenda and action are well aligned to national frameworks where they exist. And where they don't, use the city's agenda and plans to influence the development of a national development framework. This is really where the issue of multilateral governance, cooperative governance, vertical integration, those things come in, working with the local government associations. Is it easy? Not easy, but it has to be done. And we are busy doing that. In South Africa, we are working with SAGA to try and really ensure that happens in cities. The process ensures that city sustainability and resilience agenda, as well as actions, are backed up by science, data, evidence-based, and best practices. This is a tough one for Africa given the data poverty, but it's an area and a gap that we need to confront head-on. We shouldn't just have our agenda defined by feelings or emotions of the mayor during campaigns, but really base it on science. And that's also what COVID-19 has emphasized, the importance of science, the importance of data. And this encourages the use of, in our cities, the use of baseline assessments, diagnostic assessments, strategic appraisals, also modeling and scenario planning, not just really thumbsuck plans. Finally, this process ensures that planning and delivery involves diverse sectors and stakeholders, both internal within the city and external. This actually ensures that there is local relevance, there is buy-in, and there is also strong bargaining power when it comes to implementing the vision and the plan. We are now even starting a work stream where we want to engage labor unions especially in African cities. In some of the global north cities, there has been such work happening. The political leadership is also about, this is the leadership standards, it's about transitioning from promises to action and being very transparent on delivery. So political talk is cheap, no lip service on sustainable urbanization. We need to see measurable delivery. So cities are therefore supported to remove barriers to action. Is it availability of data? Is it technical capacity? Is it funding? Is it governance or institutional weaknesses? So we support them. A good example, we have a C40 cities, empowering cities with data program, where we are brokering partnerships with relevant organizations to ensure that the cities have data and knowledge they need. We have a C40 finance facility where we are trying to remove the financing of funding barriers so that they have what they need. In terms of technical capacity, we also facilitate peer-to-peer learning. So all these we provide to ensure that they plans translate into action. Now, in relation to transparency and accountability, the leadership standards require cities to report city progress annually through a global platform to help set a global baseline, but also to help benchmarking. For those that remember, there was a time we used to publish climate actions in mega cities where we're documenting some of these actions every year. And mayors are also required to publish best practices for other cities to be inspired. In addition to that, every year, mayors are supposed to submit their actions for the C40 Bloomberg Leadership Award. It's like an Oscar of mayors on climate action, which is given to mayors at a very prestigious global event. Started in 2013, international recognition towards the critical role cities could play as a leading force for climate action around the world, and also to just showcase success stories from cities. Finally, my last point is on the leadership standards, and there are about 6. I've just taken the 3 that I want to emphasize in this discussion. The last one is we recognize that political leadership is about inclusion. It is about distributed leadership or shared, collective, and extended leadership. We're looking for cities that have permanent instruments and mechanisms to improve participation and inclusion through kind of like institutionalized spaces for dialogue. So we have a tool called C40 Playbook for inclusive engagement that support mayors in the C40 network to create spaces for other stakeholders, especially the weaker voices in the city, to contribute to urban transformation, whether they are labs, whether they are neighborhood walks, whatever method they use, but those should be institutionalized and they should be there. COVID-19 has clearly taught us that we cannot leave people behind. We cannot leave others behind. We need spaces for local communities, spaces for business, spaces for academia, research institutions, and many more in urban planning and delivery platforms. This also calls for understanding problems from diverse perspectives in the city. So don't just bring smart city, but bring a smart city that actually addresses the needs of diverse stakeholders or diverse residents in a city. We need to analyze climate actions from an equity perspective with clear equity targets and demonstrating how climate actions are also contributing to delivering social and economic benefits, to reducing inequality and to driving a just transition for workers into decent and green jobs. All these lessons have been emphasized by COVID-19. But finally, my final point on the leadership standard is a tough one for city residents. We would like to see levels of responsibility and accountability beyond the mayors to the residents themselves. Often at times, we only place accountability on the high level political leadership, but a thriving political economy should also have responsible and accountable citizenry or urban residents, not residents that destroy and burn infrastructure for social service every time they are angry. If you are angry with Hastings, maybe if burning is a solution, please just burn his jacket. Don't go and burn a clinic. Don't go and burn we want that kind of irresponsible citizenry to actually be addressed, and we have constructive and developmental kind of like citizenship. I will end there, and maybe we can talk more during the conversation. But that's what how we are looking at leadership in C40 mayors and in C40 cities.
Thanks, Hastings. And I think it is really great to hear that there's such focused work happening to, I guess, support and nurture a new generation of political leadership in various African cities. And I think alongside the question of a narrative that resonates with our context and history and challenges, of course, you need role models as well. You need to be able to point to very specific leaders that have, if you will, kind of mastered the arts of navigating these complexities, right? So I want to ask one question, and then Wilfred Jana will then pose a question. We'll unmute him and he'll ask a question. So I guess my question is, and this is something that is informed both by me being South African and based here, and the distortions in our political process, but I know is a dynamic in other African countries as well. So one of the big challenges, of course, is the very strange form of multi-party democracy, right, that has grown up in Africa in the last 20 years or so. So you have the political party system and the internal political party dynamics sort of have an overbearing role on public policy, whether it is to control the procurement system, or the way in which you become a mayor is actually decided in the party, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems to me one of the critical skills for an African leader is to know how to navigate their political party. And I was curious whether this is something that has come up in your processes, in your leadership development, in your conversations, because again, the political parties is often a black box in our discourse. We kind of talk about, or we refer to it, but we don't really have a very useful handle on, what are these animals and how do we modernize them, right? Because many of them, of course, started off as liberation movements and then became the inverse of their own ambitions, right? They've come to represent the opposite of everything they stood for in terms of their internal functioning and the lack of internal democracy and accountability. So there's a deeper debate here, I believe, about how do we create a vision to modernize our political parties, and how do we restore a much more profound culture of accountability and democracy in our political parties. And so I'm just curious whether this is something that has come up, and if you have a reflection on that. I'm going to ask Wilfred Jana to ask his question. And I think he's from Malawi. Wilfred?
Oh.
Welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your amazing presentation, Hastings. So my question really is on mayors. I'm from Malawi, and here in Malawi, mayors only have a term of 5 years. And one challenge we have with our governments is that after these 5 years, if we change mayors, the other mayor sort of does not quite continue any of the work that the previous mayor was doing. So are there any measures that C40 has put in place to ensure a smooth continuity of this agenda? Thank you.
Hastings, do you want to take those two questions? And then Astrid, if you could maybe look at Leonard Mweziga's question and then respond to that when Hastings is done. Hastings?
Right, thank you so much. Both of them really, really good questions. And yes, these conversations have happened in C40. We are going through kind of like a period of political volatility in African cities, South African C40 cities topping the list. But as we speak now, we have no mayor in Dar es Salaam. I was impeached. We also have no governor in Nairobi. So how do you navigate when really politics has gone in and you have a leader that you invested in as a mayor, and this leader has been impeached? South Africa, Johannesburg, Tshwane, Durban, Cape Town, they all have experienced mayoral changes. We actually had to deploy another approach. Instead of just focusing on the mayor and the technical officials, we also had to begin to target the council. So the council is representative. There are different political interests there. The mayor, of course, comes from one of the parties in council, but the council is representative. So we are now beginning to engage council committees, which are representative. And if you convince council committees, there are different parties there, and if they buy into it, then one of those political parties will have a mayor eventually, and we use those councillors that on that committee to push the agenda with a new mayor. The best tool for us, what we have realized is, number one, of course, have your best data and science. Number one, we can argue politics, but science is science, data is data. You just have to make that point clear. Second, really bring that science to what does it mean to the people. All those councillors are elected officials. What does this mean? Forget about the mayor you don't like, if you don't like that mayor. Forget about the mayor you don't like. You need to do this because your ward is going through. So they embrace that. So really engage with them on the basis of what does it mean to the people. And of course, finally, also engage with them to have the big picture. So really sometimes the picture you have is narrow politics. They don't even understand the provisions of some of the international or regional commitments. Try to also give them the big picture and also bring best practices from other cities. So if there is a city that has succeeded, bring it to the councillors and let them learn from other councillors. Those are some of the things that we are using to navigate or to ensure continuity in a space of political volatility. And Wilfred, the same we use for the short-termism of the mayoral offices to ensure continuity. The Malawi situation is unique. I don't know whether you know, I come from Malawi as well. And 2.5 years as a term of office, I've spoken to MAGA in Malawi, the Malawi Local Government Association, to continue pushing. 2.5 years is not enough. But that's the situation that we have now. So how we ensure that Blantyre continues after Mayor Wild Ndipo finishes his 2.5 years is to make sure that the council to do what I call agenda dispersal. So the agenda should not just be with the mayor, but disperse it to council and even disperse it to the citizens. Whichever mayor comes in place, if the citizens are empowered enough, they will actually demand the change that we want, the transformation that we want. If the council is empowered enough and is aware, the council will push the new mayor and demand the transformation that we need.
Thank you, Hastings. Astrid?
Sure. I just want to very quickly comment on Wilfred's comment about 5-year terms and discontinuity. The other problem about 5-year terms is that you're always in an election cycle. It seems that everyone is always campaigning. And that's also problematic. There's never time to do it. And I think in some ways, the idea of bringing in an executive director in Kampala who's a technocrat who's not bound by terms was to overcome that issue to some extent, and also someone who's just very technical. The question then is, how does that work in terms of all the other positions? To Leonard's question, very great to see Leonard. Leonard's someone I've worked with and actually who's done a lot for Kampala too, so great to see him on this call. I would posit, Leonard, that I don't even think it's like 30 years of new sort of I think you posed it as 30 years of neoliberal planning tradition. And I feel there's even beyond that, I think we're just sort of locked in at the moment. I mean, if you think about Kampala and you think about areas of Kampala, Nakasero is one of the very richer areas, and you think about those massive plot sizes, those are all ex-colonial administrative places where those plot sizes were what was deemed correct, but now we're kind of locked in. The other part I would say is actually recently, a year or two ago, I was invited to China, and I had a really interesting, fascinating conversation with a professor who were providing a lot of African scholarships for urban planners, African urban planners, to go study in China. And she said to me, she's like, Astrid, but I've never even been to an African city, and I teach them everything that we know because we really believe in urbanization, but I feel like teaching them how to swim and then sending them back to a place without a swimming pool. And so that's exactly, so I think it's not just even traditions that have sort of locked us in, I think it's even new traditions that are coming in now that just don't really fully understand the complexity. And I think we need to overcome that by much more localized planning. And in Kampala, we really are starting to do that. The KCCA is doing much more neighborhood planning, bringing people together at a neighborhood level to sort of see what's there, reimagine their neighborhood. They're starting to do efforts along a citizens charter. To Hastings' points, it's not about only what the government does for you, it's about what your responsibilities are as a citizen. And this is a topic that we haven't touched yet in this conversation. Edgar, you mentioned it briefly. But I think is probably the most ingrained topic as to why planning in its sort of, I want to say traditional form, as you mentioned, then it doesn't work, is because our land tenure systems are totally different from anywhere else these planning models have ever been implemented. And that is a reality that's not going to go away tomorrow. So, we always, a lot of the plans that are created for us reimagine away these land tenure systems, and they go like, the first thing we need to do is reform the land tenure system, and then what you got to do is plan like this. But that's not going to happen. There's historical, cultural, political, economic reasons these tenures exist. So then how do we reimagine planning given the tenure forms that we have? So these are some of the questions I think that we need to ask ourselves.
Great. So I'm gonna, at this point, invite Sithole to respond to what he's heard thus far, and maybe give us some sense of how UCLG is positioning itself to support local governments in the larger urban transformation debate, but also just what some of their learning and lessons might be. Sithole, are you ready for us? Just to say, and before I give the floor to Sithole, that I'm really grateful that you've agreed to step in on behalf of your colleague, Jean-Pierre Lombassi. And as you can see, Sithole has grown a beard to bring some gravitas to the role. So I really appreciate the effort and look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Edgar. How's it to Astrid, to Hastings? I think Taiba is gone, am I right? But yeah, but I think importantly, it's greetings to everybody that is here. And I think as you correctly say, Edgar, I just came in at the tail end of how the webinar was being organized. So I'm gonna be very economical with my comments. Safe to say that I have sort of structured them, and I've taken some of the notes that are coming from the colleagues that were presenting here. So I'm the Deputy Secretary General of UCLG Africa. It's an organization that represents local government in the African continent, and you can imagine already that's huge. Right? So when I first walked into the organization last year, I was told we have 17,000 member cities. And I was like, wow, can you imagine? I mean, if I am being performance managed, and I'm being, Astrid is laughing, and there are 17,000 municipalities in the African continent, and I'm being asked to perform at 50%, how am I going to even reach, let's say, 7,000 municipalities, right? So but the point that I'm trying to make is, first and foremost, the one thing that we need to recognize about the African continent, which is something that I'm also learning, by the way, is that it's a huge continent. You cannot even begin to make comparisons with Europe, the Americas, and in fact, the East. It is huge. So when you say that out of the 54 AU member states, only about 34 countries have some form of a reflection of what an urban policy should look like, that should give you the magnitude of the problem. So you're talking political economics, understand that in fact, at the very base of everything is the absence of, it's the absence of good policy that makes you to localize the urban in order to then to start talking about the political economy of that city. And I think that's quite important. And needless to say, as a consequence of the weaknesses of these policies, therefore, Edgar, you are right to perhaps choose words such as most of our countries in the African continent are paying lip service to the implementation of the urban agenda. But I guess it is also because the African continent itself, you cannot blanketly talk about an urban policy in the African continent, blanketly, right? So it's quite important, I think, for us to be able to differentiate. So there are big municipalities or cities, metropolitan type of cities where Taiba comes from, which is Lagos, Kampala, Johannesburg, Nairobi. But there's also so Astrid calls them secondary cities. I think let's have a debate about that. I think there's something about that word secondary cities in its imported form that gives the impression that they don't have a role. And in fact, they have a big role, as Astrid was saying. So I tend to refer to them as the intermediary cities. They tend to intermediate between the rural part of the country and the metropolitan part of the country. So the role that they play has to be seen in that light. I think we can't again, therefore, leave out of Africa the impact and the inheritance that the African continent has had from colonization, the post-colonial, the apartheid stuff, I mean, in South Africa. And I think, sometimes people do not understand the impact of some of those policy prescripts that were imposed in many of these African countries to the in these cities. Mapungubwe in Zimbabwe is one such early ancient city as I make these points. I think the best Africa needs to begin to do is to develop its own narrative around this issue of urbanization, so as to be able to answer the bigger policy, or so as to be able to help answer the bigger question about political economy. Because the political economy is nothing other than the relationship between the politics and how those politics enhance economic productivity so that there is change in the ordinary lives of citizens. And perhaps towards the tail end, I will exemplify what I'm talking about, because there's some very practical examples that are coming from South Africa currently. So what is the African narrative? Is it there, Edgar? I mean, you research these things on a daily basis. And is it something that we all at least have consensus on, however small the consensus on? So what does it mean to have an African urban policy, right? So what's the narrative? And I suspect, as I indicate, I mean, that narrative has to be able to speak to the most metropolitan and up to the most rural, because the danger, and this is where the politics come in, the danger of importing they are currently is that we could unintendedly leave out what Hastings was saying. Don't leave out anybody behind. We could inevitably end up leaving the rural population, which in many African countries is quite predominant, if it's not in the majority. And I don't have figures to prove that, but I know that there are considerable numbers of people that would be left out as a result of us just adopting the policies as they are. And then the second point, the second of 3 points that I would like to make, relates to what I would call the weaknesses or the strengths of the urban agenda that will necessarily be dependent on the narrative, on the urban narrative that we want to push. So there's a link between the narrative and whether or not our urban policies will be strong, either country by country or region by region, or just generally the continent. There's a strong relationship. Why am I saying so? If you look at the AU Vision 2063, and it's 7 aspirations. I mean, and the aspirations are good. I mean, you cannot fault the African Union for those 7 aspirations. But when you have to ask yourself a question such as, so practically, what does this mean? And with no due respect, they tend to be floating on air, okay? There's no way through the African where you feel that the policies can be anchored somewhere. And I think this is what I'm talking about when I refer to the narrative vis-a-vis of our policies. So what should that look like? It means we need to change the architectural design of the state. The current architectural design of the state doesn't help facilitate what Hastings has just said, the ability of making have the powers and the decentralization. And again, just to get what does centralization, we should take it in the African continent. So there's something, therefore, I'm saying that needs to give in terms of us being able to change the design of the state. Again, I see in African endgame when it comes to local government, but I think South Africa's constitution is very strong on giving powers and functions to the local sphere. In fact, it doesn't even speak about local as a level of government. It says it's a sphere of government equal to all, equal to the national as well as the province. So there's something that's guaranteed in the constitution. Can you see that in most of the African countries? I don't think so. At least with the legal studying that I've done, you don't see that. So we need to change that architectural design so that it gives effect to the powers and functions that local government has. Now, that being said, does South Africa apply? No. There's a big debate. I mean, I know that the Minister of Cooperative Governance, most recently in the last 6 months, she's been talking about the need to change the financing formula with which we are funding the local sphere of government so as to give effect to the powers. Because you cannot run local governments with about 9% of the total budget. And I'm just utilizing the finance. Astrid made reference to the fact that most local authorities in Africa do not even have the powers to be able to go and raise funds outside. That's more difficult. Can you imagine trying to raise funds within your national fiscus and you only get a small percentage, and yet everybody talks about the fact that local government is where the tar hits the rubber, you know. And so there's something about that needs to change so as to be able to give effect to the principle of a differentiation, so that we differentiate differently between the various types or typologies of the municipality. So that's the second biggest issue that I want to make mention, Edgar, when it comes to this thing of the political economy, because I think in that way, you then are able to empower communities, which is where the issue of the political economy, I think, matters most. So let me go to my very last comment, which is, there's something that's happening in South Africa at the moment. It's called the South African Urban Festival. It starts tomorrow, and it's linked to the World Celebration of Urban Month, October, and it will culminate in World Cities. I would encourage people to just, if you Google Urban Festival 2020, and what's happening there is that national government and partners that are part and parcel of Urban Festival are having a change in mindset, where they are saying, look, as government for the last 20, 25 years of democratic South Africa, what we've really been doing is to do things on behalf of people. How about if we move from doing things on behalf of people and get people to give us ideas? So what's happening is that the festival is meant to harvest these ideas. And little by little, these ideas will be provided with seed funding, right? So those seed funds will turn into prototypes. Prototypes will turn into pilot projects, and pilot projects will then turn into programs that hopefully government can then adopt and fund. The intention is to make government a partner of society, right? Not a dictator to society, by harvesting and encouraging ideas to happen. And who knows, the political economy may turn, because an 80-year-old individual who owns a small piece of land, has never had a title deed, will suddenly be able to be given a title deed. That title deed turns into intangible assets with which you can start serious negotiations with financial lenders. Who knows? You turn a part of your land and provide rental stock in your backyard. That's income coming into that particular household. You are now beginning to talk turning the political economy. Of course, look, let's cross fingers that it becomes successful, and then it's something that can be replicated. And it's not the only one. I mean, there's many other ideas that are being thrown in the Urban Festival through the various workshops and webinars and seminars that are being put there. But that's the 2 cents, if you don't mind, that I would like to leave the discussion to, by saying there's a big narrative, Hastings and Astrid, that needs to be developed. There's a big African narrative that must still itself be differentiated, that recognizes colonialism, slavery, and the backgrounds that we have inherited. And we can't be crying foul every day, you know, yeah. That's number 1. 2, there's a need for us to strengthen the relationship between what the African Union has done and what needs to happen at a country as well as at a local level. And heads up to you, I mean, this is part and parcel of empowering civic participation, I think, in the work towards us realizing the policies that we have. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Sithole. Really appreciate that. So there's a couple of questions in the chat function, and I'm just going to ask Hastings to take his pick if he wants to pick up on any of them. But while he's scanning those, I just wanted to respond to one thing you mentioned, Sithole, and just introduce sort of another scale, I guess, of political economy reform. And I think, you know, both you and Hastings, it would be great to get your take on this. So it seems to me, if we look at the spatial distribution of the economic nodes on the continent, you've got a fascinating geography in West Africa in terms of the proximity between Lagos, Accra, Abidjan, and so on into Dakar. And then, of course, you've got the sort of North African belt with Alexandria and Cairo being a particularly strong node, but then on the other side, Rabat and Casablanca. Others linked down to the East African capital cities, and then Southern Africa, the Gauteng city region with Maputo and so on. And I have this fantasy, right, that if we look at the GDP of these city regions, that one can begin to imagine over the next 5 to 10 years, a new political geography emerging where the governors and the these very powerful city regions recognize that they can, in fact, they should have a seat at the table, so to speak, in terms of the Pan-African agenda. So just to come back to circle back to questions of narrative, how do we build a coherent vision that is rooted in the continent? Is Agenda 2063 that or not? One of the sort of practical implementation aspects of Agenda 2063, of course, is the 16 catalytic projects that the African Development Bank is financing in part, and that the infrastructure coordinating group is running on behalf of the African Union. Now, what is striking about these mega projects, of course, is that they're all Pan-African, right? They're big logistics projects, either hydro dams or railway links or big road corridors and so on. But none of them ever regard the fact that you need city governments and the big urban nodes to be part of the planning and the implementation of these mega infrastructure investments. So that's just one example. But if you look at the volume of infrastructure investment going into the continent from a Pan-African scale, these are the big ticket items, right? This is where the ADB and so on is putting their resources in. So how do we get the economic sort of nodes that matter for the African continent to begin to say, let's formulate a coherent response to these Pan-African infrastructure investment agendas, and let's form a political bloc. So it doesn't have to be sort of a formal thing, but it could be a network-based thing, recognizing the 10 big city region economies on the continent, for example. So this is a fantasy I have, but it also strikes me that if we can begin to get some of our governors and mayors to think of themselves in regional and Pan-African terms, it will alter the small pond problem that you often have, where they sort of are so focused on their backyard and the political intrigue that they forget the bigger picture and the opportunities that sits there. And clearly, if we can't create a set of incentives, economic incentives for political leaders to change the game, right, to upscale their ambition and how they think of their futures and their identities and so forth, you know, we're never really going to get them to shift out of the kind of realpolitik that Tybert was talking about earlier. So I'd love to hear whether you think my fantasy is completely just a fantasy, or whether there's maybe something there that we could be thinking of as a political project to shift the nature of the debates about how does city governments intersect with the Pan-African agenda. So that was sort of just one. And also, Sithole, to say that I think we do need to pay attention to the projects that have the political status as symbols of implementation of Agenda 2063, because they are able to marshal an enormous amount of infrastructure capital, because they kind of, you know, they're just endowed out of the gate with that kind of political capital. So, okay, so let's look at the chat function. So we've got a reflection from Etienne Brits on the disconnect between lived realities and daily survival and the tactics of urban dwellers. So how do we bring these things and planning processes into conversation with one another? There was a similar comment about how do we sort of imagine what this alternative form of planning might be. And Lone Paulson made the remark that we've got to figure both the urban and the rural, similar to what you were saying, Sithole, you know, sort of how do we think together what she calls the development desires of both. And so clearly there's something here about a very different spatial imaginary where the urban and the rural are not pitted against each other, but are seen as a continuum and interdependent and symbiotic. But practically though, what can we do with that? Where do we go with that thought? Yeah, so who?
Can I go first?
No, you can't go first because Hastings.
I'll tell you why. I might be running out of a battery. That's my. I might.
Okay, go first. Go first.
Yeah.
You don't have your backup options.
So just to say that Hastings is going into a very important meeting where they can add another African city to their leadership group. So he can't stay till the end, but.
I will stay on as long as my battery is on, but I was just afraid that
as long as you don't talk for as long as your battery is on.
Yeah. Edgar, you are spot on. I mean, this is the principle of differentiation that I was talking about. Incidentally, the UCLG Africa is re-engineering its organization and its strategy. And one of the things around this principle of differentiation is to say, we need to put together a program that is exactly what you're talking about. So there's an African Metropolis program that UCLG is conceptualizing as we speak, that seeks to make your city region cities and put them into a block for purposes of two things. Yes, taking them to the negotiating table with their African states and presenting them as a block, but as well as ensuring that they put their skin in the game. Because you can't just negotiate if you're not putting your own city resources towards the infrastructure developments that are there. So you are quite spot on. So something that will be realized as long as you're staying at UCT and doing the academic work, because we need your support.
Noted, thank you. And considered me all buttered up, Hastings.
All right, thanks, Sitole. I think, Edgar, you're spot on, and I'll tell you why. For me, I feel that Agenda 2063, the Africa we want to see, requires some African coalitions. And it could be a coalition of mayors, a coalition of researchers, a coalition of innovators. But we need to begin to think of really these coalitions that can actually dissect specific issues and come up with some African solutions. And the kind of initiative you're suggesting points us in that direction. And I'll give an example from Seafort again, excuse me. So the connection of cities for us has traditionally been global. So you connect cities to a global, but we reached a point where we felt that, no, there are some issues, we need Africa-specific solutions. So we have now started, we have now a network of African cities on waste management, a network of African cities on urban food systems. So these cities are also connected to the global network of cities on solid waste management, but we felt that there was need to have a kind of like a regionally based and focused network of cities to talk about African issues and African solutions. We need to do that, and UCLG, Sitole is spot on. UCLG provides us the platform in terms of the political platform that we can use. But of course, also we can also have thematic coalitions maybe outside UCLG as need be. But the point I want to make is the solutions to our problems are right here in Africa. I excuse my African arrogance, but we need to harness those solutions. I'm not saying that we should disconnect ourselves from the world. We can't. We need to remain relevant to the global frameworks and of course learn from the global partners, but let's define solutions locally and do that political infrastructure. We there are a couple of men that are committed to doing that, and if you are going that direction, Edgar, I could actually also connect with a couple of mayors who would like to have an African coalition.
Fantastic, thanks Hastings. And just to say that I think one of the ideas we are listening for across the 5 webinars is precisely, how do we take the existing institutions and resources we have and think more creatively about, if you will, sort of rewiring that system so that we can in fact surface those solutions that are either incipient or embedded. But also make sure that all the various knowledge platforms, whether it's C40 or the information circulates as quickly as possible. And as people try and adapt that information to the local context, they know where to draw support from. And so to really rethink the role of our universities and our planning schools and so forth to be much more engaged with these on-the-ground experiments to test alternatives is very much the direction we want to go. And we're hoping that the webinar series can help us refine what that framework could look like. And then go to our big institutions like the African Development Bank, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, etc., to say, you've got to invest in us, right? There's no one else who's going to solve these things. It's only the African institutions themselves, with, of course, the support of our international partners. But, you know, it sits with us. But at the moment, the institutions who have those responsibilities and capabilities and so forth, they're not resourced to do it. And so we kind of, you know, we know that we can, but we're not quite sure how to marshal the effort to do it. So yeah, so thanks for making that point, Hastings. And just to say, this is very much one of the threads we're trying to decipher from these dialogues. And I want on this point, just thank you for making time this afternoon. And I really appreciate the openness with which, you know, C40 is doing its work in partnership with other stakeholders and also for your leadership role on the continent and also, of course, on our advisory board at ACC. Thanks and go well. I will hand over then to Astrid to pick up on some of the comments in the chat box as we sort of begin to close the webinar over the next 5 to 10 minutes. As you would have gathered from before, she probably straddle all kinds of topics and issues. So Astrid, we're in your capable hands.
Not sure whether compliment or an underhanded criticism.
No, not at all. Definitely a compliment. Definitely a compliment. No, it's
I've been enjoying the chat box and the reflections that are in there, and also the chat here. So let me just pick up on. I won't be able to pick up on all the points, but there are 4 sort of themes and threads that I do want to pick up on. So one, I want to thank Sithole for calling me out and calling them secondary cities. I actually do believe that that narrative is wrong, and I promise from here on out that I think the intermediary cities better reflects what they are. And also Sithole made the really great point about, sorry, your 17,000 membership still like blows my mind. I've written that down. And you know, it's 17,000, the thing is it's 17,000 and growing, right? It's not 17,000 and shrinking, it's 17,000 and growing. And so that we can't put everything in one basket. And Gaitan in the chat box mentioned he's from Mauritius and talks about different scales of the problem. And and again, I don't want to call it a problem, different scales of the opportunity actually. And I want to say the other thing is we also within countries have different scales of the opportunity. Like cities are not even one thing within one country in and of itself. And we got to think about what localized solutions we need within national borders, not even just across the continent as well. So I think that's a really good observation, Gaitan, where I think, you know, it's not even just a continental countrywide thing, it's an in countrywide thing too. The second thing is, what do we call cities? And this is something that we're now going through the reckoning in Uganda, because we've just named 50 new cities, but we're now sort of retroactively thinking, but what does that actually mean? And, you know, implicitly, like people think, oh, that means more money, but actually no. Like we have very you know, relatively stringent legislation. In no ways the types of powers that you have, Sithole, in South Africa in terms of what cities can do to raise revenues. Nor do we have the budget to be able to disperse more intergovernmental fiscal transfers to be able to do that. So what does it mean to be a city? And I think even broader than that is Lena's point, where she was talking about what about other cities? And Uganda here is again a really fascinating case study, because in the space of a few months, a small village in northern Uganda became our second biggest human settlement with the wave of refugees. Is that a city? Do we manage that as a city? You know, it has all forms of a city. I think really, you know, I've read what, you know, just incredible stories of how, for example, Kakuma in Kenya functions. It is a city. So what do we call a city and how do we manage these things? And I think in the context of fragility, which unfortunately is still a reality across our continent, we are going to have to rethink when does a settlement become a city? What is defined by that, and how do we manage and govern that, and what, you know, what does that mean to us? So I think, Lena, your point is very well taken there. The third thing is I wanted to pick up on Edgar's point about could we bring city managers and leaders to the table in terms of these discussions that are happening on Agenda 2063. Honestly, some of the most inspiring people that I work with are city leaders and city management, is, you know, across our continent. And I think it's really to do with the point that Sithole made is, you know, I think Sithole, you put it, it's where the tar hits the road, right? They got to respond to everyday problems. They know how it is. They can't not respond, right? And so I think, yes, definitely, let's bring them to the table. But here again, I want to bring up a point that I mentioned in my discussion is it's about then also an emphasis on entities like the AU, entities like the African Development Bank, entities like the World Bank, entities like other development partners, because who do they bring to the table? Who are their counterparts? It's always national government. All the big loans that are coming here to the city still have to go through, they're negotiated at the national government level and they go to the city. So, you know, it's not only about, do we have the people to bring to the table? Do we have the fire? We absolutely have the firepower to bring to the table. It's a question is, does that table open and accept that firepower, and how do we negotiate that space? And in some ways, I think we see, particularly, I see it it's a shame Hastings is not here, because it seems to me like, particularly in the climate section, mayors are just like getting sick of waiting to be asked to come to the table and just bringing their own sort of leadership to the forefront and creating their own fora. But actually we would, you know, I think it is absolutely vital that we bring them to the large fora, which once sort of ends on my fourth point. And again, this harks on to your point, which is these catalytic projects. Should we be thinking cross-continentally? And absolutely yes, because that's, you know, I'm an economist, that's what's going to drive the economic power of cities. At the same time, and this is again to Etienne's point in the chat about thinking about the lived realities, I think we got to work at both ends of the scale. And talking to some really fantastic colleagues who work in the Kampala Capital City Authority, you know, we have a city that, you know, is increasingly flooding when it rains. And they're like, you know, what we really would love to do is just some community drainage, because when we do the community drainage, the community starts to believe in us and starts to believe why we need to tax them to be able to then do more. And actually it really helps them. So I think, yes, let's think at the catalytic big project scale. We do need to do that. But at the same time, let's, as Etienne has highlighted to us, let's think at the lived reality scale and work at both ends of the spectrum, because we've really, you know, if we're going to think about these political economy changes and we're going to think about this buy-in to the urbanization process and this bold and ambitious action agenda, the people who really need to be convinced that it can be done and the people who really need to buy in are the people to whom this is the everyday reality, to whom this is a game of survival, as Taibat put it, to whom this is where the opportunities lie. And so I think that's just sort of the point I want to end on. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's, if we're going to go bold and ambitious, we have to go at it from all directions.
Fantastic. So all that's left to me, I just want to maybe summarize some of the highlights of the conversation as part of the continuity between the various conversations, and then just thank the speakers. So what we've heard is narrative matters, that this narrative needs to be contextually resonant, which means we've got to have an imaginary that speaks to the various scales, and particularly intermediary, secondary, and smaller cities, and how this landscape of a continuum between the rural and the urban is really central. But that also reminds us that in many ways, if you think of authority and governance and regulation, the rural is very alive in the urban, and the role and the centrality of traditional authorities is but one example. But there's of course also forms of authority and forms of subjecthood of being that is very alive in the city, and often because of scale and context and resources and the prevalence of violence is often profoundly distorted. So this is not a romantic story. We're not trying to suggest that there's some beautiful pre-colonial idyllic past that we can somehow recuperate and build a narrative. It's about building a narrative rooted on the ground. But it also means that responsive governance is absolutely critical, because if one is not able to establish legitimacy and the confidence of ordinary Africans through, for example, the story we've just heard from Astrid about drainage in Kampala, you know, whatever fancy story we come up with or whatever compelling narrative we come up with, it will just always sound empty and nothing more than rhetoric. There's difficult work ahead. It's clear that legal reform is urgent, that unless we're able to fundamentally reimagine and reconfigure the institutional parameters of urban governance, whether it's about land tenure, whether it's about political voice, whether it's about the appointment of elected leaders, it's going to be very hard to sustain the agenda that we've clarified in this conversation. And then just a final point, I guess, is to learn together, is to find the mechanisms to elevate the small stories of success, of instruction, of inspiration, and to build a culture and a movement of inspiration and aspiration, because as Hastings has suggested, we've got it well within our capabilities and within our cultural fabric. So I want to really thank our speakers who have been fantastic, has allowed us to go way beyond the idea of political will and think in much more precise and careful and nuanced ways about what the political economy of urban transformation might mean. I want to then welcome you to join us next week, again at 2 o'clock, for the next theme, which will be sustainable infrastructure as the key to success, where we will have colleagues from who work on macroeconomic policy at the UNECA and at the African Development Bank responsible for urban policy to share with us some ideas about how do we connect the resource pots with the sustainable infrastructure imperatives. This session has been recorded. It will be available on the ACC YouTube site. I want to thank my colleague Alma Vivius, who's been responsible for making sure all of this happens and runs smoothly. And then very importantly, our partners, Alfred Herrhausen Gesellschaft, Dark Matter Labs, Peak Urban, the Gothenburg Center for Sustainable Development, and the forerunner to that, which is the Mr. Urban Futures Program. Thanks everyone, and thanks to our speakers, and we look forward to welcome you next week.
Thanks, Edgar.
Thanks, Edgar. Bye-bye.